Koszary and Paul Hoang. My name is Alina Jones. I'm an Associate Marketing Manager at Hachette Learning, and I manage the marketing and promotion for our IB course books while being on hand to help with our virtual events. Please be aware this session is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be shared with you all by email tomorrow. Please can I ask that your microphone is muted throughout this presentation until the Q&A session. You are welcome to type your questions into the chat box at any point during this presentation. Please be sure to select everyone as the intended recipient in the chat box, and I will read your questions aloud to Soshan, Joseph, and Paul during our Q&A today. We hope you enjoy the webinar, and thank you again for your patience while we have addressed the technical issues this morning. If you encounter any other difficulties, please enter them into the chat box and we will do our very, very best to address them. I will shortly pass you over to our hosts, but first, here is a short introduction. Today, we are joined by Joseph, who is a highly experienced IB educator. He is the EE coordinator and the English IB coordinator at Charlton College, ESF Hong Kong, an international school, and IB World School with over 1,200 students. Joseph co-authored the best-selling textbook for English language and literature, and is an experienced IB examiner with expertise in the extended essay component of the diploma. We are also joined by Paul, who has authored best-selling textbooks and is an experienced examiner for various examination boards and a seasoned IB workshop leader. Paul is a highly experienced IB educator with over 25 years of teaching experience. He has held the position of Vice Principal and Diploma Programme Coordinator at a prestigious IB World School in Hong Kong. Paul currently teaches economics to students at an IB authorised online school. So, over to you, Joseph and Paul.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. So thank you for giving up your next hour or so to join us for this webinar. Apologies once again for the technical hiccups. We're going to get Eleanor or Shoshan to share the presentation, please, if you can. You'll all get copies of this, so Eleanor will make sure you'll get a copy of this at the end, along with the recording. And then if you have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat, and we'll try and address them as best as we can towards the end. Okay. Do we have the presentation, Eleanor, that we can use?
Very shortly. There we go.
Fabulous. So my new favourite TOK question is now, who is Rose Taylor? Right. And Rose Taylor's replying. Can we skip to the next screen, please, Eleanor? Okay, in the interest of time, I think if we can maybe skip the first few slides and go straight into the EE, please, that'd be great. Okay, so the first part of our presentation is going to look at, just to give you some reassurances, what has not changed in the new guide. So there have been changes, and Joe will go through those with you in a moment, but just to give people reassurances, there will be some unlearning and relearning to do, but let's look at what remains the same in the new guide. So it still remains compulsory for all DP candidates. So it's a failing condition if they don't pass their extended essay, they must submit the EE. So I think that's probably why we're all here today, so we can support our students with the new extended essay. There's still a common assessment criteria, so it doesn't matter if you're doing the interdisciplinary essay or a subject-specific essay, it's going to be marked using the same criteria. Joe will go through that with you later on. The word count limit remains at 4,000, and it's approximately 40 hours of work. Number 5, very, very important, independent academic research. So this is not a commentary, it's not a review of an article or a topic that they've studied in lessons. It's actual academic research. So more about what that entails later on. And they still attend 3 compulsory reflection sessions with their supervisor. So there have been tweaks, but we'll go through what those tweaks are with you soon. Okay, so next slide, please, Ellen. Thank you. Okay, so this is from the new guide, so key skills. So the new reflection session really focuses on these skills, so transferable skills. We have 2 from the ATLs, so we have research skills and self-management. The EE, of course, includes reflection, what we used to call the RPPF, and it's about student agency. So it's about students taking responsibility for their own learning, their own independent academic research that we mentioned earlier on. Okay, and this is not new. I mean, the students in the IB programs develop these skills from the MYP right the way to DP and beyond. Okay, next slide we can, please. Okay, so there's still reflection. So Criterion E remains reflection. 500 words is the word count limit for that. Just as we all get to grips with what the RPPF used to stand for, we get a new acronym. So it's now called the RPF. Same as before, if there's a non-submission, the students will get 0 for Criterion E. If it's not written in the correct language, so the language of their EE, that will also get a 0. So please make sure you adhere to that rule. This is not a change, but there are a few instances when this is not followed. And the extended essays remain externally examined by an examiner. Okay. In our new book, we do have top tips on the type of questions that you can ask students in the 3 different reflection sessions. So again, more about that later on. Okay, and then the next slide, please. This is very important, of course. Nothing changes here. So what we have now is still a failing condition if they don't pass their extended essay. At the moment, as you know, 7 out of 34 is the current pass mark. We haven't had first examinations yet, not until 2027. So we don't know what the pass mark will be, but it's likely to be around about 6, which keeps it in proportion with the percentage we have at the moment. So very important that they keep to that. As you can see from the grid, it's not a change. They need to pass the extended essay. All right, and so that's what we're going to be focused on today. So I think Joe is going to take on the next session, the next part here, which is about what has actually changed.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Joseph. Nice to see you all, ladies, gentlemen, Rose Taylors. I'm a little bit unwell, so if I have a coughing fit and disappear, please send help, but I'll do my best. I think like many of you, I'm launching extended essays with year 12s at the moment, and that's obviously the old course. This is the new course. But I'm excited to take you through a lot of the big changes. And you can see number 1, I've called the jargon de jour, the new piece of jargon that you're going to be using a lot. So pathways is one of the big new changes you're going to see. The subject focus pathway is very similar to what you're doing previously. So there's still a single subject pathway as before, typically just a single subject studied by the students. And this can also include across disciplinary subjects like ESS or lit and performance. But the new exciting thing is the interdisciplinary pathway. And I will talk about this in more detail later, but essentially this is the world studies kind of changed and evolved. So the interdisciplinary pathway involves studying 2 subjects in your EE alongside registering it in one of the 5 interdisciplinary frameworks. So I will expand on that, but I think that's really the big change and the most exciting thing to talk about. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Right, other changes. Number 2, the guide. The guide is actually changed quite a lot now, and it's far more student-centered. So this means it's got a lot more direct address. It even switches to using you, as in referring to the students in long sections of it. And that means that the language is actually a bit clearer, and there's a bit more of an explanation to kind of explain what the IB intend with various terms and various components of the EE, which, to be honest, is very good for me and you guys as teachers too, because sometimes I'm a little bit confused, and now I read this and I'm like, ah, that makes a bit more sense. So it kind of actually helps some of this student-centered language in the guide for teachers too. There's also going to be an extended essay support material document. This isn't out yet, but it's going to complement the EE guide. And there's some good stuff in there. There's some stuff which, I mean, it genuinely at one point goes, mind maps might be useful. Here is a mind map, and it explains mind maps, which is a bit obvious, but there's some other stuff which is quite helpful. And I think you're going to find that giving students elements of the guide and sections of the support material is going to be really beneficial for the students now. And there's a lot more from the IB you can just pass straight to the student. Number 3, subject-specific tweaks. There's not actually lots of major changes. What has changed is generally in the direction of kind of opening things up and simplifying things, which I think is a really positive move. For example, in language A and language B, the categories have been removed. So that category 1, 2, and 3, I'm an English teacher, so I had to deal with this. I sometimes had to remind myself each year what they were. They're just gone. You know, in English, just do something in English. It's fine. So these simplifications, I think, making it easier for staff and for students. Also, things like time-based rules are being removed for subjects like econ, history, and global politics. So again, it's all the kind of machinations of the E getting out the way so the students can just focus on their curiosity and their research questions. So I think all that's quite positive. And tying in with that, number 4, there's just more of a focus on the research question. So obviously it's an inquiry-based component. There's more of a focus on that. And I think a good example of this is the title page. You no longer need a title to go with a research question. So title page is almost now a bit of a misnomer, but that delineation between topic, title, and research question just kind of like gone. They still refer to topics in the guide, but title page is simplified. And I think, again, it just shows this direction of travel towards making things a bit simpler and easier for students and staff to follow. Next slide, please. Okay, as Paul mentioned, it's now the RPF. One of the P's has gone missing, maybe down the back of a sofa in IBHQ somewhere, but they've simplified that a little bit. It's no longer the RPPF, it's the RPF. And as Paul will expand later on, it's now simply one 500-word commentary done at the very end, rather than that kind of piecemeal approach where you do one at the beginning, one at the middle, one at the end. And all that administration of like getting them to write their reflection, keep it locked, that kind of thing, again, all goes away, so a lot simpler. There's still the 3 mandatory reflection sessions, so they're still doing that kind of initial, interim, and viva voce, but now you just need to record when they happened, and the actual reflection can take place at the end, and they can obviously base it on notes they made from those reflections. So that simplifies things as well. And then, perhaps most importantly, the assessment criteria, number 7, they have changed, and it's now out of 30 marks. I would say that, again, this is more of an evolution than a revolution. There aren't huge changes, even though on the face of it, it can seem like that. I'll expand on this in more detail in the next section, but as a quick summary, that Criterion D presentation worth 6 marks has gone, which is sad, because that was always quite a nice one where students could just get a load of marks for making it look correct. That's kind of been subsumed into Criterion A, which is worth 6 marks in total. So that's changed quite a bit. Sorry, Criterion D being 4. That's gone down into the structure section. So it's now a strand in Criterion A. And that's a big shift. And some of those easy marks have gone. And if we go to the next slide, please. Criterion C has changed as well. That's gone from 12 marks as critical thinking. And it's kind of been broken down into its components. So it's now Criterion C and Criterion D. So it's been split into a 6 mark and an 8 mark couple of criteria. Again, this is kind of taking what was a bit of an awkward, unwieldy criterion, and it's making it simpler and easier to follow. So we now have analysis and line of argument and discussion and evaluation. And I'll go and explain those in more detail later on. Number 10, the reflection, so Criterion E, that has changed from engagement to reflection, and it's now worth 4 marks, and it focuses more on the growth of the learner through their EE experience. So again, another shift in language. And again, some of the marks have shifted around a little bit too, down to 4 instead of 6. And number 11, the criteria themselves, you'll find they're a lot more student-friendly. So this is another positive move where I think they're explained in a bit more detail, and the language used around them is expanded a bit more. So sometimes when there's a bit of ambiguity, there's a bit more detail there, both for staff and for students. And there's a real push by the IB for the assessment criteria to be used throughout the entire process. They're no longer something you look at right at the end or gets applied to a finished essay. They really want the students to be referring to the assessment criteria throughout the process. So I know most schools will have done that anyway, but there's a real explicit push now from the IB for the students to be engaging with the assessment criteria throughout the entire process now. Number 12, the guide itself has changed a lot. It used to be enormous and it has shrunk quite a bit. So they have renamed a section of generic guidance, which applies to all EEs, but now the subject-specific guidance section is organized by subject groups. So they've kind of consolidated things a little bit, and they've kind of taken a few redundant elements out. And now you have, for example, an INS section, and it does still talk about those individual subjects, but it's all together in one place. So again, all of this seems to be in the direction of just trying to simplify things, make things a bit clearer and easier to follow. And I think that, again, that's a nice positive move in the guide. Okay, next slide, please. And the jargon. So as ever with IB, there's lots of jargon, and we've talked about a few of the changes already. What we have now is a few shifts in language, which I think as supervisors and especially EE coordinators, we're going to have to get very fluent with. For example, subject-specific essay, that is very N26. All the cool N27 kids are calling it the subject-focused essay and the subject-focused pathway. So this idea of pathway is going to become common language we use quite a lot. The World Studies Extended Essay, again, is kind of gone. It's now referred to as the interdisciplinary essay or pathway. That's going to be incorporating what basically used to be the World Studies, but also opens up a lot more options as well. The RPPF, the RPPF, is now the RPPF. It's changed the reflection and progress form. Again, not really major changes with that, but it's just been simplified a little bit. Academic honesty is out. Academic integrity is in, which I think maybe speaks to this kind of, I don't know, semantic shift around it being more about ethics as well, instead of just necessarily trustworthiness. So again, that shift into using academic integrity when you're dealing with students rather than academic honesty. Subject-specific guidance, that's been changed now to more like subject group guidance in the guide. And the teacher support material is now the support material. You're saving 2 syllables there, so think of the enormous efficiency savings, that's good. And presentation is used a lot less. That used to obviously be one of the criteria. Now it's referred to as structure and structural conventions. And that's often the language they use around some of those presentation features and layout features that we used to talk about. And also, again, engagement, which was one of the old criteria, that has now changed to reflection. So I did a quick Command F on the guides, and it used to be used 119 times in the old guide. It's only mentioned 8 times in the new guide. So it's now just framed around reflection a lot more. So that's a bit of a jargon cheat sheet of some of the changes going on. And I think we'll get used to that as we go through the process the first time, and it will become very easy for us as we get used to it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, there has been a change in the mark scheme. So I'm going to talk about the assessment criteria now. You've got a few changes which seem quite big, and I think really a lot of it is just rejigging and moving around some of the elements of the assessment criteria. Ultimately, it's the same, I think, and I do think that a lot of the assessments and the extended essays from the old system, you put them in the new system with the new assessment criteria, it's fine. They'll still pass in the same way and fail in the same way. So I don't think there's any fundamental changes, and it's not like we're suddenly going to need to start adding extra sections to our extended essays. So I think that's quite reassuring, but there are a few shifts and simplifications. And I think one of the big ones is obviously Criterion C being broken down into 2 different criteria. So next slide, please. I'll go through each of them relatively quickly. Criterion A, so they refer to it as legacy criterion, the old one. So this new criterion, it's gone from focus and method to now being the framework for the essay. So the framework for the essay just means kind of like the fundamentals you need to have there to then put all the content in the essay and do your analysis and put all the meat on the bones. So they've said it assesses the research question, the research methods, and the structure. Previously, it said the topic, the research question, and the methodology. So you can see it's largely similar, but the big difference is the old Criterion D has been added into Criterion A instead. So as ever with the research question, they want it to be specific, focused, obviously connect with the content of the essay, and allow for like a clear, strong line of argument. So it should just be a good, very valid research question that's going to lead to a good essay. As for the research methods, they want students to clearly explain and evaluate how they're going to do the research, how they did it, show that they got a range of sources, and show that they applied the research methods they said they were going to use. And obviously through those research methods, that's where they get all of the subject matter to do all the analysis and all the other stuff relevant for the other criteria. Structure is the new one really for Criterion A. So the basics are intro, body, conclusion, the classic kind of structure of an essay. They do say that's part of it, but they also add in this strand called structural conventions. So if we could just go to the next slide, please. So Criterion D, the old one, has become, it's kind of been downgraded to a strand, which is fair enough, really, because sometimes it was almost overly easy marks. And it's now referred to as structural conventions. So this obviously varies depending on the subject area. And maths EE still looks very different from an English EE. But what's good is in the subject group advice, they do give some specific examples. So when you go in the new guide and look at your subject area, what you should find is it says structural conventions and gives some examples. And it's not too prescriptive. So I do think a bit of the pedantry of the old system is kind of going away a little bit. They're not trying to micromanage too much, but it does cover the usual stuff like labeling diagrams, appropriate headings, etc. So those typical presentation features from the old system are now basically assessed in Criterion A. And it's not as simple as this, but I mean, there's 3 main things in Criterion A. You can almost say it's maybe 2 marks compared to the 4 from before. Okay, next slide, please. All right, Criterion B. So the legacy Criterion B and the new Criterion B, very similar. I'll spend less time on this. It's now knowledge and understanding. Previously it was knowledge and understanding, still worth 6 marks. So they say it assesses knowledge, understanding of terminology, and understanding of concepts. So again, largely similar to before. In terms of knowledge, obviously the research materials that they've gathered with their research methods to show they've got some good subject matter, showing they can understand the terminology, using it consistently and accurately throughout, and showing an understanding of concepts, so kind of organizing their ideas and information, categorizing it, drawing links through a conceptual understanding. So very similar to before. Next slide, please. Right, this is maybe the bigger one. Criterion C, or legacy Criterion C, is now split into criteria C and D. And I think, again, this makes it easier for the students to kind of get their heads around, but also maybe for the supervisors too. So Criterion C of 12 marks is now Criterion C analysis and line of argument, which is worth 6 marks, and Criterion D discussion and evaluation, worth 8 marks. So Criterion C, first of all, again, just those keywords analysis. So obviously avoiding description, taking your kind of research materials and then doing something with it. So being able to produce relevant findings to your research question. So kind of doing the critical thinking and the actual proper analysis of the essay that is marked here. And also the line of arguments. So this is largely just how you connect all the things together. And they specifically mentioned discourse markers as well. So guiding your reader through the kind of the narrative of the essay and your thinking. So they talk about linking together your research question with your research findings and how it all leads to your conclusion. And it's more about kind of showing how all these things tie together more than the actual content of what you're saying. The actual explanation of it is more in Criterion D, discussion and evaluation. So this is worth 8 marks. And you can see with discussion, this is where you kind of expand and elaborate and explain your different perspectives and how your ideas all come together. So this is a balanced discussion of your findings with some clear links to evidence. So that's now separated out. And evaluation, which is obviously very important. So consistently evaluating how effective your essay is. And again, they want that kind of peppered throughout the entire essay. So a consistent evaluation of the strengths and limitations of what you're doing. And I think they obviously would rather that not be just a token section in the conclusion or a token section in the intro, but something which is kind of weaved throughout the entirety of the essay. Okay, next slide. All right, Criterion E. This has gone from engagement to reflection. Paul will expand on this more later on, but essentially it's shifted a little bit from what it became previously, which I found that a lot of students just became more like, there was an obstacle, I overcame the obstacle, this is what it showed, and kind of just a slightly repetitive, slightly mechanical way of doing your RPPF. I think they're trying to move away from that by saying you should focus more on your skills transfer and changes in perspective and what you've gained from the process. So I think they were a bit wary of what it was in the past. They have changed the focus a little bit, and Paul can expand on this. And it's also now worth 2 marks less than before. So it's dropped a little bit in terms of the mark scheme overall. So what that means is the combination is 30 marks rather than 34. So previously, I think, was it 7 marks to get a pass? And that was roughly kind of 20%. So maybe it'll be 5 or 6 marks, but we'll know after the first run through what that kind of passing mark will be. But I don't think it's going to make a huge difference. Obviously, some of those easy marks from the presentation and from the reflection have dropped off a little bit, but I do think it will still not make too much of a difference in terms of how students are doing. Next slide, please. Okay, there's also this really good book. I should mention the book. So there is a whole chapter on this, which talks you through in a bit more detail the assessment objectives, the assessment criteria, the mark bands, the grades, and it really tries to guide students through how all these things are connected, because I think having a grounding in the purpose of the extended essay and how that actually eventually follows through in the assessment criteria, but isn't really the main thing, that there are other broader objectives for the extended essay behind the scenes. That is something which the IB are trying to make more explicit now through the way they've set up the guide and the support materials. And obviously this chapter kind of gives students a load of activities to complete, reading up on the objectives, trying to understand why the criteria are what they are to fit in the objectives, etc. So there's a few tasks for them to complete in their RRS and really kind of give them that foundational understanding of what the extended essay is and why they're being assessed in the way they are, which, as I said before, is something the IB really want the students to do from now on. They really want the assessment criteria to be central to the entire process throughout. Okay, I think I'm done for a bit. So over to Paul.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, so can we just go back one slide, please, Eleanor? We've got loads of questions, which is fantastic, and I know and I appreciate trying to hear something for the first time, trying to absorb all the information can be a bit overwhelming. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we'll try and clarify as much as possible towards the end. I've tried when Joe's been presenting to address some of the questions that you put into the chat. So the next section is on AI and the EE, and you're probably all thinking AI is artificial intelligence. It's not, it's academic integrity. So that came before the AI. But we do have AI and EE. So we're going to move on to that now then, please. And this is an area that is of increasing importance for the new extended essay. So a lot of, when we did the EE review, the curriculum review, a lot of teachers were asking questions about the purpose of the extended essay in the era of artificial intelligence. Can't our students just type in, write a 4,000 word into a prompt, 4,000 word extended essay about this topic, answer this research question, make a few mistakes so that my supervisor won't spot that it's been created by AI. So the IB knows about this. Very importantly, the IB is not going to ban the use of AI in the extended essay itself. More about that in a moment. But what the IB does say is they cannot double dip. So what that means is they can't use something, for example, from their history IA and then use it to write an extended history extended essay based on their internal assessment. That would be double dipping. So double dipping is using something from another assessment piece to gain an unfair advantage to work on the extended essay in this case. Very importantly, and this should be part of your school's academic integrity policy, supervisors mark one draft only of the extended essay. So drafting and redrafting is not allowed. And that would be, malpractice as such. The third and final reflection stays the same, the viva voce, that there's no change in that. And that is also part of the academic integrity checks that you do with your students. So if we go to the next slide, please. Okay, so like I mentioned just now, the IB has made a very clear statement. It will not be banning the use of AI in the extended essay or for any kind of research project or work that these students do. It's the same as saying banning, for example, calculators, spreadsheets, or search engines. You know, when they came about, there were some apprehensions. You know, maths teachers initially said, we don't want calculators in the classroom. And now it's literally not realistic to teach mathematics without calculators. So there are some ideas there on the screen there of how the IB says that students can use AI as ethical inquirers, as ethical students, but ultimately it is their responsibility. So the work they submit to the IB must be authentic, must be their own. Anything they use that is not theirs must be fully acknowledged. So citation and referencing. But in the new guide, it does really make it clear that supervisors have a role and a responsibility to support students in this process. I mean, at the end of the day, they are 16, maybe 17 when they start to write the extended essay. And that's a really daunting task for a young teenager. So we do have an important role as supervisors to guide and to educate students about the importance of academic integrity. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so there's some of the roles and responsibilities that the IB have set out for us as supervisors. Now, what's new in the guide is something called check-ins. So the students, as you know, have roughly 3 to 5 hours of supervision, and they have 3 compulsory mandatory reflection sessions, and that then culminates in the final RPF. But in between that, partly so we can support the students, but also partly so we know what they're doing, because we can't authenticate the work unless we know along the journey what they've been doing. And these are called check-in sessions. The IB doesn't stipulate how many of these we can have. So you'll need to use your professional judgment. Some students will need more check-in sessions than others. So those are not formal, they're not recorded. They're meant to guide the students so that they're on the right path, and you can check for academic integrity as well. Okay, so we go to the next slide, please. Okay, so again, something new. If you're an EE examiner, and I know we've got some examiners in here, in this group, we've got coordinators here. A new instruction for EE examiners, as you can see in red, is that they will need to check for citation and referencing. Okay, they'll need to contact their team leader if there is any suspicion of malpractice. So again, I think this is worth telling your students when they're starting to write the extended essay. So as a minimum, and it depends on which referencing system they use. So it doesn't matter if it's MLA, APA, Harvard, Chicago, etc. They need the following information there. This is from the guide. So it doesn't have to be perfect, but what it does have to do is acknowledge that the student is using the work or the words of other people. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so on the RPPF, so the supervisor had to write a supervisor's commentary in the past. Now, as you know, that didn't really count for any of the marks, and it was more or less to really talk about engagement that Joseph talked about earlier on, the 118 references and so forth. It's not about the supervisor's interpretation of engagement anymore. So on the new RPF, the supervisor has to authenticate the work. The student also has to acknowledge and authenticate the work as their own. So to do that, you need those check-in sessions, you need the mandatory reflection sessions as well. So as you can see there, it is now explicitly the role and responsibility of both students and supervisors to authenticate the work before submission to the IB. Okay, you'll need to get your EE coordinator, and I know this sounds all harsh and so forth, and it is only a small percentage globally of students who actually fall into the academic malpractice category. In May 2024, the IB data shows that there were over 8,000 cases of malpractice. So that's a large number, 8,000, but it's a small percentage of the number of candidates who submitted their work. So you'll need to make sure that there are systems in place to check for the authenticity of students' work. So you can speak to your coordinators about that to get support from them. You don't need to do that alone. Okay, moving on then, please. Okay, so word count limit. So again, from the guide, this is kind of like your cheat sheet, as Joe mentioned earlier, about what is and isn't in the word count. So tables. Now, tables often causes confusion. So I've just put in brackets in their data. So this is statistical data, not putting analysis into a table. So students can't just put, you know, a piece of extended analysis into a table and say that's not part of the word count limit. This is inappropriate use of tables. The same for things like footnotes. Lots of students put definitions into their footnotes in their essays. And again, that's deemed to be trying to circumvent the word count limit. So as you can see on the right-hand side, they can only use footnotes and endnotes for citations and references. Okay. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so I'll just give you a quick moment just to read that. This is from the new RPF. There are only 2 pages on the RPF now. There used to be 3 pages. Let's just have a quick read of that, please. Okay, so the IB is putting in the bit in red. The IB is saying to us as professionals, if you have suspicions of the work being, you know, not the student's own work in its entirety, you must raise that with your coordinators, your heads of schools. You should not be submitting the essay if there are any doubts about its authenticity. That's meant to protect you as an educator, but it's also to do with the agency aspect of the EE process. Students need to take responsibility in an ethical way for conducting, writing, and submitting their extended essays. Okay. All right. So I think the next section. So we've got a couple of questions before we go on to the interdisciplinary, just pop up, if that's okay. Supervisor comments are no longer required. So I will, when we go for the RPF section, show you what supervisors are required to do. All right. So for now, all you need to know is supervisor comments are no longer required. So many of you will appreciate that change. It was never part of the assessment criteria anyway. Okay. All right, so keep those questions coming, but I'm going to hand over to Joe now for the interdisciplinary essay.
Okay, everyone. Hi, I'm back. This is probably the most exciting new thing. So for me, as the EE coordinator at my school, it's probably given me the most food for thought in terms of what we're going to be doing. And I think this is really the main big idea of the new extended essay. This is the thing where they've perhaps opened things up the most. So before, with the world studies, I mean, I never loved it. It was always a bit confusing with the local and global contexts and all these kind of extra little rules around the world studies extended essay. And I think a lot of those guardrails have been removed, offering a lot more flexibility. So I think this is where there's a lot more opportunity for students to follow their kind of passions and their curiosity a bit more without the kind of rubric and the mechanics of the EE process getting in the way. So I think this is probably the thing which I'm going to have to think about the most in terms of how we administer our EEs. And I think each year we're maybe going to kind of do more and more interdisciplinaries because it's really trying to break free from that siloed off subject areas approach and promote this new kind of interdisciplinary inquiry, which we're seeing a lot more in NYP with interdisciplinary units, and it's kind of clearly a direction the IB are moving towards. So I've included here in these 5 colorful boxes, 5 of the examples they give of why a student might do an interdisciplinary extended essay. And the first one on the left is essentially, if they did what was always a world studies essay in exactly the same way, that's still fine. So the closest to kind of the legacy world studies is a complex issue of global concern. So this obviously reflects something in the modern era and talks about how with these complicated problems, just limiting it to one subject can sometimes not really deal with the issue you want to explore. So the world studies as it was, you can still do just under a different name, and it still would count as an interdisciplinary EE. Right, the next one's where it gets a bit more interesting. So a question of personal interest or a deeper understanding of an issue or a problem. This is where I think students sometimes used to have these constraints of a single subject EE, but didn't want to do the whole kind of local and global context and all that world studies stuff. So they just ended up sticking with a single subject. Now I think they can really follow that idea wherever it may take them. So rather than being constrained by the single subject, they can now actually throw in a bit of history or throw in a bit of another subject, and it doesn't have to be evenly balanced. So an example that they give is doing graphic novels in English and talking about the costumes and the dress design. And they said you could turn that into an English and design tech interdisciplinary extended essay, where it still might end up being mostly one subject. But as long as you're bringing in elements of another subject and it's meaningful, you can do it. And it's an interdisciplinary extended essay. Same thing with a deeper understanding of issues or problems. Again, you might find that you get to a certain level of depth with your issue and your research question, and then you think, oh, I could bring in some ideas from this other subject I've been doing, but before you couldn't. Now you can just bring it in, and you could switch it to an interdisciplinary extended essay. The last two examples they give, the pink box, insight, theory, or method applied to another subject. So almost kind of like having the toolkit from another subject. There might be a really good theory from psychology that you want to apply to your English extended essay. You can now do that and just switch it to an interdisciplinary. So using theories and methods from other subjects onto the content of a different subject, that now is completely fine. And exploring the boundaries of DP subjects as well. So just kind of like doing some new creative ideas. They don't want a creative research question to not be followed just because of the conventions of a single subject or the limitations of the old world studies. So I think there is a lot more flexibility, and there's a lot of examples given in the textbook, but also in the new guide coming out. But generally, it's just broadly expanding the opportunities for bringing in multiple subjects into your extended essay. So I'm expecting, for example, at our school, for us to have each year more and more interdisciplinary extended essays as we get more comfortable with the new system. So next slide, please. So there is still a little bit like the world studies, a series of kind of themes. So these global themes from the world studies are now replaced with the interdisciplinary frameworks. You know, they're fairly similar. There's, as you can see on the diagram there, a few different examples of them. They're pretty broad, and you don't have to connect to every single term in each framework. So for example, culture, identity, and expression, you could just deal with culture, or power, equality, and justice, you could just deal with justice. And I think really, you don't have to start with these frameworks. Instead, you start with your kind of curiosity, your research question, and then you work out which one it fits into, and it's fine. So it will be registered under one of these 5 interdisciplinary frameworks when you submit it to the EE, but it's not assessed in terms of how closely it links to that framework. And really, it's just a way of kind of organizing your ideas. But generally, any research question should fit into pretty much one of these 5. There'll be some sort of a link. And I don't think you should see it as a particularly limiting factor. Instead, it just opens up much more opportunities, and these just have to be kind of layered on. Okay, next slide, please. So what makes it interdisciplinary? I've got a table here from the textbook, but again, there's similar stuff in the guide. You can't just do it for no reason. As long as it is purposeful and it's clearly got 2 subjects present and contributing to your conclusions, it's okay. Even if it's like a 70% one subject, 30% the other. So I've put here relevancy trumps balance. Like as long as the other subject is relevant, it's okay. You don't need to be 50-50. And I think in having 2 subjects as your kind of extended essay subjects, it really broadens your tool sets. The students have so much more knowledge, concepts, theories they can draw on from 2 subjects instead of 1, that it should make for some far more interesting extended essays. So here is a list of the kinds of things that they can do. The interdisciplinary elements should be either knowledge or concepts or theories or perspectives or methods. And as long as there's some of these from the other subject, that justifies it being an interdisciplinary extended essay. And it may even just be there's a theory from one other subject that you've taken for your extended essay, And that would be enough as long as it's clearly purposeful and making a difference. So for me, this is the big change. And I think it really opens up a lot more opportunity for interdisciplinary thinking and fewer limits being placed on what the students kind of inquire about and explore and have in their research questions. So if we go to the next slide. There is a chapter on this. Again, there's a sort of screenshot of it there, but there's a very student-friendly FAQ asking questions like, does it need to be balanced? Do I need primary data? That kind of stuff, which just kind of, I think, puts them at ease in terms of seeing the interdisciplinary as being something a bit risky, because I don't think it is anymore. There is a step-by-step process, including kind of explanations of just how to go through coming up with an interdisciplinary extended essay, making sure it's actually worth doing it in an interdisciplinary extended essay, and just really clarifying their thoughts before they delve in to doing a interdisciplinary pathway instead of a single subject pathway. There's also a section which talks about the assessment criteria as well, which is basically the generic assessment criteria is applied to an interdisciplinary, but then you do have to also refer to the guidance on the 2 different subjects that you're doing in the guide as well, because that will also affect how they're applied. So in general, I think this is the big new exciting thing. And I think for the EE coordinators out there, this is the thing worth focusing on the most, just in terms of how things are going to change. And the reassuring thing is, if you still just do a world study style thing, it's basically been absorbed into this. But then you can start trying out the new types of research questions that are opened up. Okay, thank you. Next slide. I think we're over to Paul.
Great, thanks, Joe. I was just in the middle of typing. I was just about to type, I really do enjoy teaching or supervising rather the world studies extended essay. So I can't see that changing for the interdisciplinary one. When teachers ask in workshops, what makes a good extended essay, it doesn't matter whether it is in business management, economics, English, whatever the subject. For me, it's about me as a supervisor learning something new. This excites me, I'm really enjoying reading your extended essay. You're teaching me something new. I think that's the power of the interdisciplinary extended essay. We've had loads of questions about the IE as Joe was presenting. So I just want to very, very quickly tackle the common questions. They should be 2 DP subjects, of course, they have to be rather, but they should be high level. That's what the IB recommends, just because of the depth of the academic research required. That students who do an essay subject and they want to extend that for an extended essay, that may require a significant amount of work, maybe beyond the 40 hours, for example. So it's a strong recommendation. So it's not a formal requirement as such. How to distribute supervisors. Joe mentioned the coordinators in this group. It's not for us really to advise on how you should allocate supervisors in your schools, especially when you're doing an interdisciplinary essay. There was a great question from a teacher about, will that relieve some pressure on the humanities, because they tend to be the most popular EE, certainly in her school. So the IE may help with that allocation, but that's a school matter to deal with, really. And we can't really give advice in this particular webinar about that. Can they do the IE in the same group, such as economics and business management? That came up. The answer is absolutely. The IB does not prevent that. And like Joe said, it's about the purpose. Where are they going with this? It's not, I'm choosing subjects X and Y because they're 2 of my HL subjects. It's where you go with this particular research question. Okay, let's move on to reflections then, please, and we can answer more questions towards the end. Okay, so the big change for the RPF is it is now a single 500-word reflection, and that's going to be problematic for many students or many scenarios. So, for example, we come across lots of schools who say, teachers who say, well, how do I supervise a student that I've just taken over? Because their supervisor's gone on maternity leave or has left the school. I didn't really know what they did in year 1, DP1. So how do I supervise that student? How do I do the reflections and so forth? So this becomes even more apparent in the new guide. So what the IB recommends strongly now is to use that researcher's reflection space. So Joe mentioned that earlier on, the RRS. In the past, not that important, didn't really need to use it. It's a nice platform for students to use to help with reflections. Strong recommendation now is for all students to use an RRS because when they write that single reflection statement, they need to remember, what did I discuss with my supervisor, 12 months ago, 6 months ago, and so forth. The RRS is not a formal requirement. It doesn't need to be submitted, but it's simply a platform that allows students to record their reflections along this EE journey. Okay. Like the 4,000-word essay, examiners have been instructed not to read beyond the word count limit. So if conclusions, for example, in the essay are written in the 5,000th word, it just won't be credited. Same for the reflections. There was somebody who asked what it takes place if the supervisor comments are no longer required. And the answer is nothing. You don't need to do anything. Teachers are busy enough as it is. So just because something's been removed, don't think I have to do something else in place of it. You can breathe, all right? You get a bit of your time back. You don't need to do anything. It's very simple. I'll show you on the next slide in a moment. There are only 3 things you need to do with the RPF, but supervisor comments are no longer required. Okay. Again, if you go to the next slide then, please, I'll just show you what that might look like. Okay, so this is a screenshot of the RPF. The previous PPF was 3 pages, and the 3rd page was the supervisor's comment. And there was no word count limit. So some supervisors wrote an extended essay, no longer required. So as you can see there, hopefully in the yellow highlights, you still need to do 3 formal reflection sessions. The candidate writes 1 single reflective statement. And again, no more than 500 words. So having their researcher's reflection space helps them to write that after their viva voce. They can't submit the EE without the RPF. IBIS managed back just won't allow you to submit without it. So again, this is kind of like a safety net in terms of the academic integrity process as well. And then, as you can see at the bottom, this is the same as the current RPPF. So supervisors just use a drop-down menu, you put down the month, the DP year, and just add your initials to authenticate that the mandatory supervision reflection session. Okay, and then the next slide. Okay, there was a brilliant question in the chat when Joe was presenting, saying, if the guide has been simplified and it's easier to read for students and so forth, why has Hodder Education, Hachette Learning, produced a book? I didn't really know how to answer that, without being too biased. But one of the things we do have in the book is guidelines, so suggested questions that you can ask students in the initial, interim, and viva voce mandatory reflection sessions. So, we provide a little bit more advice than perhaps what's in the guide, teacher talk to help teachers and to help students as well. Okay. And then number 6 and number 7, they carry on from the old syllabus, so that's not new. Okay. All right, and then the next slide. Okay, so before we go on to the Q&As, I think we've seemed to have rushed a little bit in the presentation, just trying to make a little bit up for the time we've lost at the beginning. So in terms of getting further help, it's great to see we've got a large consortium of librarians in this group. We had a big group from India, for example, so thank you for joining us. They should be to help you or help your students with things like research and referencing skills. You're going to have more experienced teachers at your school, so feel free to ask your heads of departments and line managers to help you. You've got your EE coordinator, your DP coordinators at school. The IB has just launched a new extended essay website, so we've hyperlinked that in the presentation for you. I think perhaps the most common question we've had on the chat is, will the presentation be shared? And the answer is absolutely. So these are all hyperlinked. So you can go to the new EE website, keep, maybe bookmark that because that will be updated. At the moment, the support material isn't on there yet. And of course, because we haven't had first assessment, there won't be any student samples under the assessment tab, but they will be added in due course. please share the support material with your students when those become available. And again, like Joe said right at the beginning, it has been written for students to help them, so that they take more ownership of the EE process. So, hopefully, again, that alleviates some of the workload for you. Okay, and then I think there's one more slide. Okay, so again, what the IB have put up on the new EE website is a list of videos there, as you can see. So the role of the librarian in the EE process and so forth. So it's a bit like mini professional development. So when you get a chance, click on those links, watch those videos, and they should help you. And then there's a final one, which we found out earlier on this week. Next slide, please. So the IB just launched this Nano CPD site for the new extended essay. So again, this is hyperlinked. So when you get the copy of the slides, when you click on it, for example, I don't know if you can see my mouse hovering when I do this, but under this one called Overview of Changes, you'll hear the curriculum manager talk about the changes to the new EE. All right, so that's something that you can do in your own time, as well as watch the recording of this this webinar. Okay, so on the last or penultimate slide, I should say, on the penultimate slide. Okay, so we've got this new book as well. It was released, what was it, 9 days ago, at the same time as the release of the new extended essay guide. It's been written in collaboration with the IB. So they've given Joe and I feedback on this. The publishers have worked very closely with us. Shoshan's been great. She's been guiding us along the way as well. So the book is endorsed by the IB, and we do give top tips, advice, checklists to help students. So it just makes it a little bit more practical for students to help them in this particular piece of their assessment. You can download a sample chapter here, and Shoshan's also shared the link for the e-inspection copy if you're interested in that. Okay, and I think that takes us to Q&A. You've just seen it. If there's another slide, I think that's the last slide, Eleanor. Yeah. Okay, so how much time do we have, Eleanor, for Q&A?
Well, we have run over a short way, but providing that people are able to stay on a little longer if they have a question, are you happy with that, or would you prefer to collect them and respond later?
I'm okay to address the ones that we've got here. That's all right, Joe?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Great.
So
I've got a copy of them in order, or would you prefer to go through the chat?
I've got a few. I've got 18 from
Okay.
when Joe was presenting. I think that's probably going to take us to the end of our webinar session.
Brilliant.
I think some of them I can answer, some of them Joe can answer, some of them the publishers can answer. So I think the number one question was, will we be sharing the presentation? So I think we've done that one. The next one I've got is, do we teach the old guide until November 26? The answer is yes. So this new syllabus is first exams 2027, so May 27. The third question is from a teacher in India. How can we best get hold of the new EE book from Hodder Education? We are based in India. So I don't know if Shoshan, you might be the best person to answer that.
Yes, if they can contact their local agent who they normally get their books from, they can help. Otherwise, there is an email on our website, with our sales contacts.
Great. Another teacher has asked, is there any tolerance above the 4,000 word count limit? They cannot. Okay, so the question was, can they place anything in the appendices to save on the word count? The answer is no. That will be deemed as academic malpractice, students deliberately trying to circumvent the word count limit by putting any type of analysis into the appendices. Okay, so no to that one. Can a student write an interdisciplinary essay in both economics and business management? The answer is yes. And like Joe says, it doesn't have to be 50-50. In the old world studies extended essay, it needed to be around that 50-50, but the IB have given more flexibility now. So it could be 70-30, for example, doesn't have to be. Again, go back to the reason, purpose.
Just to reiterate, as long as you're drawing on some either explicit knowledge, some concepts, some theories, some perspectives, or some methods from another subject, and it needs to be there to kind of explore your research question and come to your conclusions, that's it kind of justified, and that'll be okay. And I've seen a few questions about supervision. There should still just be one supervisor for an interdisciplinary. So it's all set up for one supervisor. They will certainly seek advice, often from subject teachers. But generally, yeah, it should be one supervisor for an interdisciplinary EE. Yeah,
absolutely. So it's the same as the world studies now. So in the past, you know, a 50-50 split, it may be difficult to say who the supervisor should be. But if the split is now, say, 70-30, then perhaps the person doing the 70%, that subject should be the supervisor. The next one, I think Joe can answer. What is the difference between criterion C and D in the assessment criteria?
Okay, so, I mean, there's a little bit of overlap, as with kind of the criteria in the past as well. But I do think criterion C, one of the big things is the line of argument. So the line of argument is more about kind of threading together how the ideas connect. And that's criterion C, whereas criterion D is what they call discussions. That's when you actually go into the detail and kind of discuss your findings. So one is like how it all connects together in C, and then D is more kind of elaborating on your findings and what you're trying to say. And I do see how those two are kind of interlinked, because your line of argument is obviously tied in with your discussion. So it's been separated out a little bit, but I do agree there sort of seems a bit of overlap on the surface. We will see when the examiners are trained for the first time with the actual examiner advice, whether they separate that out in a bit more detail. But I do think there's a bit of a difference between the two. And obviously criterion C includes analysis as well. So that's the idea of going into sort of looking for connections, actually kind of taking your research you found and trying to come up with something fresh and new. And that's the analysis of it. But then when you explain your ideas you've come across and the ideas that you've developed, that's the discussion. So yeah, if it was a Venn diagram, there's a bit of overlap, I think, but it's sort of, there are separations there when you look at some of the key words in the two criteria.
And it will be useful to read those examiner reports, the subject reports, when they first come out after the May 27 exams. As with any new subject guide, there will be tweaks. So once the IB launch their category 3 subject-specific seminars, there will be feedback from participants. They'll feed that back to team leaders, subject team leaders of the EE, who will then feed that back to the curriculum manager. And then there may be tweaks along the way. All right, so it'd be worth reading those examiner reports in due course. Another question is, just to reiterate, is there only one single reflection session now? The answer is yes, and that does make up the 4 marks. Lots of questions about AI and AI detection. Does AI detect Hindi language EEs, for example? How do we cite AI usage? So again, go back to that slide about the minimum requirements. So in the same way that students can do a Google search or a Wikipedia search, they need to acknowledge the minimum requirements for citation and referencing. So they're prompts. Okay. And the IB does have guidelines on its website about the use of AI in research. So it'd be worth reading that document as well. There is another question then is, what marking criteria does citation and referencing fall under? Because I didn't see it in the slide. So in the new assessment criteria, there are 0 marks awarded for citation and referencing. But because this is an independent academic piece of work, the students have to cite and reference. So it's just a formal part of writing the extended essay. And remember that really important statement from the IB: if you can't authenticate the EE, you can't upload it. So perhaps, you know, without citation and referencing, even though it's not worth directly any marks, it may be the most important thing, because we can't submit it without it. Right. Thank you, Eleanor, for posting that. Maybe the next one for Joe. When students explore other pathways for their EE, is there any requirement to maintain a right balance between both subjects?
So there is, no requirement for like a balance anymore. When you look at the support material, it does explicitly say, does there need to be balance? And as long as it's justified and as long as there's some elements from the kind of what you could call the minor subject, it's okay. So it doesn't necessarily need to be 50-50. As long as it's there, it needs to be relevant. And I've seen a few questions about supervisors and how that could get quite complicated. And I do think having a clear process in your school for coming up with what your research question is going to be and whether you're going to do an interdisciplinary or single subject, that's going to become very important before allocating. And it's up to you how flexible you are, but maybe not being too flexible with students suddenly wanting to switch to interdisciplinary and change things around too much. But it's going to be a learning process, I think, and it's something I'm already kind of thinking about at our school as well, how we're going to go about some of these changes.
Next one's for you as well, Joe. I've just pasted it in just for make it a bit easier for people to follow. So is the interdisciplinary pathway limited to 2 subjects, or can they draw upon other ideas?
Yeah, so it's limited to 2 subjects. Anything beyond that just gets too complicated and it's too hard to do both subjects justice. And also that includes, you should not be doing something like ESS or literature and performance. Those are already subjects combined as well. So 2 is a max. And I think generally, when we did world studies, you didn't necessarily have to have a specialist in either of them for supervising. But with some of these now, if it's like largely an English essay with maybe a bit of history, I think obviously an English supervisor would make the most sense because they might be a bit more subject focused than before. And then history teachers can maybe sort of support those students a little bit. But again, these are things which I think when we go through our first cohorts, we'll see some of the processes that work best and some of the problems we come across. It's going to be interesting.
Okay, and I think because it's 1:15 now, we'll take one more question. Do you have an ebook version of the new book, Shoshan? That's just come through from Maria. Do we have an ebook version of the new book?
Yes, there is one available.
There we go. All right, so I think we'll hand over to Eleanor because it's 1:15 now.
Thank you both. Thank you very, very much. And thank you all for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the session, and just a quick reminder that the link to the recording will be emailed to you all tomorrow. Thank you, Joseph and Paul, for your time, and thank you all again for joining us.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Okay, and all the best with
Thanks,
your
bye.
EE journeys. Okay, bye for now.